Hi, everyone. Welcome to Future Talk series put on by New Relic. I'm so excited to be your co-host today. Thank you all for joining us for this amazing virtual Future Talks event. My name is Marika Garai. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a part of New Relic's social impact team, also known as the newrelic.org team. I am your host for this and future Future Talks discussions. And as such, I wanted to give you all some background on myself and the lived and professional experiences that I bring to the Future Talks table. So I have worked in the tech industry for a little over 5 years, mostly in the gig economy space, and now as a part of the New Relic community, I also have about 10 years of experience in political campaigns, both candidate and issue advocacy campaigns. And with those experiences, as well as my own personal lived experience as a queer woman, both in tech and in the political arena, I have been able to see just how incredibly important accessible tech and platform design are to any and all possible users on a platform, on a political campaign, when we're talking to voters, any of the above. And I've also seen how the design of that tech, whether it's the design of the Lyft platform, which I worked with, or a TaskRabbit platform, or the platform that New Relic uses for engineers. Really pushing equitable tech can really push communities towards more equitable thinking as well as they're interacting with that tech and with those platforms. So this is a subject that I am incredibly passionate about and have been living really for the past 15 years myself in my professional experience. And I'm excited to get this discussion going. But before I introduce our amazing experts today, a bit of background as well on newrelic.org. Through our community programs, the newrelic.org team and New Relic as a whole are committed to driving more equitable access to technology through programs focused on inspiring and equipping the next generation of technologists, helping nonprofits build impactful tech, and enabling our employees at New Relic to give back to their communities with intention and attention towards the latter two program areas. And with that, we are so proud to bring back this free virtual event to provide our community with opportunities to hear about topics and future trends impacting the tech ecosystem. So I am so excited to introduce our two panelists, but just another reminder before that happens, a reminder specifically to the relics on the call here, that this is a public event, both with relics and outside amazing participants who do not work at New Relic. So just as a reminder there, please submit any questions for Amy and Afua or for myself and the rest of the social impact newrelic.org team through the chat feature, and we will bubble those up during the chat to be able to answer them at the end. We will also have space for in real time questions to ask of our experts today. So now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our two experts for today's Future Talks discussion. Amy Sample Ward, who uses they, them pronouns, believes that technology should be accessible and accountable to everyone, especially communities historically and systemically excluded from the digital world. They are the CEO of NTEN, a nonprofit creating a world where missions and movements are more successful through the skillful and equitable use of technology. Amy's second book, Social Change Anytime, Everywhere, was a Terry McAdam Book Award finalist. We also welcome Afua Bruce, who uses she, her pronouns. Afua is the principal of ANB Advisory Group LLC and a leading public interest technologist who has spent her career working on the intersection of technology, policy, and society. Her career has spanned the government, nonprofit, private, and academic sectors, as she has held senior science and technology positions at DataKind, the White House, the FBI, and IBM. Impressive. Afua has a bachelor's degree in computer engineering as well as an MBA. So welcome, Amy and Afua. I will let you both take it away with this exciting discussion on the future of equity and tech, as well as your book.
Thanks, Marika. Afua is very impressive. It is true. Hello, everybody. It was so fun to see folks feeling excited in the chat. I'm so excited there's so many folks here, and that it's a real mix of folks from inside New Relic and outside potential partners. So many folks in Portland. Hello, Portland, represent. We are really excited. And just as a quick overview, we are going to talk for a little while. We do not pretend that any of you have read the book. You are welcome to. You are encouraged to. You are invited to. But we are not going to pretend that you've already read the book. So we're going to present for a little bit and share both some information, some values, some case studies from the book, and then we're going to open it up and there'll be plenty of time for conversation, which Marika will help make sure questions that you put in the chat don't get lost in comments, and we can talk those through. So please do know that there is plenty of time for that, and that's something that both Afu and I really enjoy. So bring your questions, put them in the chat whenever you think of them. We really do want to spend time on that. It won't just be slides. And I think Marika kind of covered this slide. So we will just jump right in.
Hi, sorry, just had something caught in my throat at the exact moment I was supposed to start talking. And as Amy said, we are so happy to be with you all today. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to hear more about how we can change our relationship with technology and really make technology work for all of us. Shout out to at least one person who's also dialing in from the DMV area. I myself am just outside of DC. And again, really happy to be here. And so as you might guess from the title of our book, The Tech That Comes Next, we're here today to talk about technology, but we're really here also to talk about community, because technology alone doesn't have that great impact. It is fun, it is interesting, but it doesn't matter as much unless we really center technology in the communities that are affected by technology, the communities that have needs and could use technology to advance those needs. So we're going to talk about technology today, but we're going to talk a lot about how communities have a role to play and how we need to center communities in our changing relationship with technology. So let's talk a little bit about where we are. And this image that you see here on the left side of the screen, the black and white image of a bunch of buildings and silos with control and exclusive and centralized power written, some discarded technology that worked perhaps at one time and has now been cast aside, the pollution that's there, all enclosed in this fence with multiple padlocks, kind of describes where we are today. And that is a world built around systemic exclusion, a world really built with the central idea being that a few people have access to power, a few people have access to controlling who then has more access to resources and to infrastructure and to needed things to survive. We have a world that's really built around systemic exclusion. But when we think about how we can build a world for the future, a more equitable world, we want to think then about what could be different. And so what if we shift our mindset from organizing the world around systemic exclusion to organizing a world around systemic inclusion? And so you can see in this image here on the right side of your screen, we've now gone from a black and white image to an image with green and colors in general. Things are growing, things are thriving. There's people in this image because we're now centering people and communities in our world. We are thinking about things like thriving, like accountability, like relationships, like shared resources, like justice and more. And that is what we're really building here. We've got access to water and food and other resources here. And so when we think about where we're going, when we think about what we mean when we say an equitable world, we're thinking about a world of systemic inclusion.
Before we talk about different ways that all of us as those people, Afua just mentioned, have a part to play in building a more equitable world and how we use technology to do so, both in the talk as well as in the book, we really wanted to start with a foundation around values, because values are kind of the most important foundation there. often technology is built without an explicit conversation about those values, right? And I think we've all heard many puns and phrases about what happens on assumption. So, but essentially that's what's happening, right? If we don't have explicit conversations about values, especially early on in any process, in any relationship, in any conversation, we move forward either assuming folks share the same values that we're thinking of, or assume that there's values that are tying us together, even if there aren't. We could just open a browser and find any example on the internet, right, of platforms, services, companies built in that situation where values weren't clear, and now they're at a place where there's real conflict at the root because of those values. So we want to talk first about the values that we see as central to what we need to think about, both for technology and just the ways we collaborate and operate together towards a more equitable future. We are offering them to you here, at least for this conversation. These are the values we want to root in. This is not a perfect list. Perfect doesn't exist. You know, these values will continue to be shaped by all of us together, but we wanted to start here first. And there's 6 of them, just in case you want to count down with me. So the first value here of what we believe an equitable world requires of us is that we value the knowledge and wisdom of lived experience. Instead of, again, making assumptions about what someone might know already, how they may contribute to a project based, only on something that maybe we could look up about their past, look up on their CV, see what traditional, often inaccessible credentials or degrees they maybe have had access to. Instead, how much more do we gain when we're honoring that there are many different ways that we each have important experiences and ideas? It isn't just one area of knowledge, it is many areas of knowledge together. The second is that we value the participation of a diversity of people in a diversity of pieces of our process, right? In everything from decision-making to planning to building. Especially when we're talking about a technology project, we really can't engage the community once for their feedback, essentially like a checkbox in the process, right? After we've already built something, here it is, community, we built this for you, and expect that kind of empty gesture would be enough for the project to even be relevant, appropriate, adequate to meeting any of those community's needs. Community members should be involved every step of the project, including the very beginning, when they could actually help scope what the project even is going to be, what direction it's going to go. The third is that we value accessibility as a priority. I really appreciate that Marika already named accessibility from the start of our conversation today. Of course, web accessibility standards are certainly part of this, but if we are considering the first 2 values here around, many different ways of lived experience and a diversity of people participating in a diversity of ways, we also mean then accessibility in the ways you communicate with the community and all of your contributors. How and where are you even meeting? Whether or not you use jargon and industry language, all of those pieces contribute really to the accessibility of what you're doing. And if you as the project team are unwilling to change how you work so that people could be better part of it, and then you find, surprise, you don't have a diverse project team and no community members are engaging with you, it is not everyone else's fault, it is your fault. The fourth is that we value the multiple ways that change is made, balancing both immediate needs with systemic change. The world is very hard and big and complex, depending on what time zone you are in, depending on how much news you've already consumed for the day. It may feel like a very hard day, right? But that doesn't mean that there is only one way forward for making change. Honestly, we know that we need both immediate view and long view all the time at the same time. There are really critical supports that people need around shelter, food, school, health, family that have to be addressed for those folks to then have the space and capacity to engage in systemic change work. And systems change work needs to be informed by the realities of what those systems are producing for very unsustainable real lived experience for other people, right? We can and we have to do both. The fifth is that we value the strength of collectively creating this vision. I find it very comforting to know that Afua and I are not the only ones thinking about an equitable world. I'm very grateful that we are not alone. And the more people who are thinking about it and dreaming about it, dreaming about that change, the better all of those dreams will be, the better all of the work that comes of it will be, because it's not just like a throwaway to say that we're stronger together, because actually we need all of these different perspectives, all of these different lived experiences, all of these different ideas and dreams to create a vision that can work for all of us. If it was only Afua and I, like y'all, we would build a great island for two. Nobody else would be there. So it is truly better together, even if that means it is harder or slower or more complicated, right? And finally, the sixth is that we value the pursuit of continued learning, skill building, and experience. Essentially, that we value that this is a process, this is a journey, this is a direction. We don't just get to the island for Afua and I and we're done, right? The skills that we need today will likely not, hopefully not, be the skills that we need in the future. As we build more, right, our skills and contributions and ideas continue to build too. So it's important that we respect and honor that work, that different people will continue to have different lived experiences, that different people will continue to learn in different ways and have interests in different areas, and that those new skills can be built and collaborated together.
So now that we understand what our foundation is, now that we understand what values we're going to build a more equitable world upon, the question is, how do we actually make it happen? Who needs to have what role? Who's doing what? Who's on first situation in order to make this actually happen? And so when we think about it, we have to recognize that change doesn't happen in a silo. As Amy said, it's not just Amy and I creating our own special island. It is a world for all of us. And that means,
I mean, I'm now very interested in this island. Like,
I know.
Yeah, how
Sorry
can I
for
get
the
a
rest
ticket
of
to
you.
come to this island?
yeah.
Exactly. But if we're going to stay here on Earth with everything for everyone accessible, it is going to be about all of us working together. So that means everyone who's dialed into this call today has a role to play. And so we hope that you think about what your role could be. And so in the book, and for the rest of this talk, we've structured it so that we have identified 5 major roles, and you'll see yourself in probably at least one, perhaps multiple different roles throughout the time. And so the first role that we identified is that of social impact organizations. These are people who are working at nonprofit institutions. These are people who are running public charities, academic institutions, government institutions, and more. And the issue that social impact organizations are dealing with is, how do we change the culture around the technology that is being used at these organizations? And so specifically, the questions that we pose to people working at social impact organizations is, how are staff supported and resourced to align technology with your mission and community's needs? It's possible to have technology extend your organization's mission and not compete with it. So that means you can start to think about ways to put technology into your organizational strategy. You can think about how you can actually leverage technology to help your humans do tasks that humans are better at, and leave the technology to automate some of those other tasks. So really, how do we think more intentionally about how to support staff and your communities with technology? The second role that we identified is that of technologist. And the definition that we use for technologist here is pretty broad. It includes people like myself who have degrees in computer science or computer engineering, but it also includes those of you, or maybe people you know, who were at an organization and someone needed to figure out how to update the Salesforce database, and they were the last ones left standing. And now they are the organization technologist. And so we're including all of those into this technologist category. And our charge to technologists is let's really think about what it means to change technology and the responsibility and the use of it. So the question we pose to technologists is, how are you investing in the leadership and capacity of the impacted community to support their long-term ownership? This means thinking about what technology people need and not over-designing or under-designing the technology solution you're using. It also means including your community in that development process, but also thinking through who's going to own this technology ultimately. How are updates going to be made? How are changes going to be made? Who is going to be able to sustain that? And what role can we have the community play in that? In fact, how can we empower the community to own this technology that we are creating together? The third role that we've identified is funders and investors, because in many circles, all circles perhaps, money makes the world go round. And so our charge to funders and investors is to really think about changing technology and social impact funding specifically. And so the question that we pose to funders and investors is, are you committed to funding inclusively for intentional engagement, iterative processes, and long-term support? And so what this means is that the work of building in community, the work of creating an equitable world that recognizes individuals from diverse backgrounds, that really takes its cue from community leaders, from community members, is that this takes time to do. It requires and should require compensation for people's time as well. And as we're looking at this, then the question for funders is, are you willing to engage in that process? Are you willing to fund a longer development, perhaps? Are you willing to question what it means to scale, and when scale is enough, and when you should scale even more? Are you open to thinking about what it means to fund a version 2.0 and to build on what has already been created, as opposed to always creating something new from scratch? So these are the questions that we're asking funders and investors to start to engage in as we change our relationship with technology, especially as it relates to the social impact sector. The fourth role that we identified is that of policymakers, because as we talk about making systemic change, and back to one of the values that Amy covered of balancing the needs today with the long-term changes, when we talk about those long-term changes, policies, laws, regulations are a way that as a society, we can really get to having that long-term systemic change that we want. And so our charge then to policymakers, as we think about changing these laws and policies, is to really think about the technology for policy making and policy for technology making, and specifically asking policymakers to think about, are you meaningfully engaging communities most impacted by digital divides and technological harm to inform proactive policies? How are we making sure that we are protecting communities from these digital harms, these technological harms, in the same way that we hope for policies to protect against physical dangers, and environmental dangers, and more? How are policymakers thinking about ways to use technology to better connect with their constituents, and to better have their constituents connected with each other and connected with the world? How are policymakers also thinking about the policies that are governing how technology is developed, what inclusion needs to look like in that development process, what should be done or shouldn't be done as it relates to perhaps the use of algorithms, social media, and a whole host of other technologies? And the fifth and final role that we identified is that of communities. We are all parts of different communities. And if we're going to be serious about centering communities, we want to make sure that we're changing conditions within communities and really use that to drive the rest of this process. Because as we think about changing our relationship with technology, we want to think about changing our relationship with others. And that's making sure that as the communities answer these questions that we're posing, we who are in some of these other roles at different times are making sure that the answers communities provide to what do you want to change and what are your biggest dreams really then define what are the social impact organizations that are created and what are their missions? What is the technology that is created? What are the policies that are created? What does funding and investing look like, and in what resources? We want to make sure that the answer communities provide to these questions about what to change and what their biggest dreams are drive the rest of this process and the rest of our relationship with technology and each other. And so we now want to make this hopefully a bit more clear to you as to how does this all work in practice. We've talked about the values, we've talked about different roles, but how does this all come together? Thankfully, there are lots of examples right now across the world about people doing parts of this really well. And for me, one of the most fun parts about writing this book was getting to talk to a bunch of people doing really exciting things. And I think we quoted something like 36 people in the book and have a lot of small case studies. But one of the larger case studies that we have that I want to share with you today is that of the organization Rescuing Leftover Cuisine. Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, or RLC, as the name might imply, was an organization designed to rescue leftover cuisine. It was started by a person in New York City who recognized that there were people in his community facing food insecurity, and there were institutions such as restaurants and others that had leftover high quality food at the end of the day. And so RLC was created on a very human scale to have people walk or bike to the restaurants and places that had the leftover cuisine at the end of the day to pick up those packages and walk them over, bike them over, otherwise transport them over to people who were in need of good, high quality food. And so it worked at a very human scale and things were fine. However, as the need grew and people recognized that there was more of a need for this, the question became, how do we continue to manage this more? How do we do this more efficiently? And so RLC used a technical contractor to build out a system to help manage all of this information. But what was really interesting and what really reflects this community-centered approach to really leveraging technology to advance their mission is that as they were doing this, all of the tickets and feature requests were put in one system, and everyone had access to the system. So it was not just the tech people at Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, which was probably a person or so, but other people at RLC, representatives from restaurants, representatives from the volunteers, representatives from the communities, everyone had access to this. They could put in their requests, they could see what was prioritized or deprioritized. The transparency was there, the accountability was there, explanations were provided when something had to be prioritized over perhaps what was voted up, essentially. And eventually the system was built and was adopted well and used to the point where now Rescuing Leftover Cuisine has gone from operating in one neighborhood in New York City to operating in 8 cities across the US. And so as we think about this example and what it shows, it really shows the importance of including all perspectives and users. So really pulling people from different roles and pulling them together using technology as a way to connect them and to connect to the mission. It centers continuous improvement. And so really had RLC recognizing that in order to run their business well, and it's now 2022, this example happened a few years ago, but in order to run their business well, you have to effectively use technology, which means you have to revisit it and make sure it continues to work for you and to have those changes as you need. And then finally, this example really shows the power of a tech-enabled mission, of really going from something at that human scale to thinking about what it means to manage and possibly scale larger by really effectively using technology.
One more case study, and then we'll open up for conversation. So a slightly different example here is Project Sunbird from an organization called Atutu. And Atutu was co-founded by someone living in the US, but they were born and grew up in Myanmar. And as someone who had come to the US for college and gained all of these skills and knowledge and degrees and relationships, really wanted to give back. I think a story that we have, a tale as old as time. So they wanted to give back. They still had family and friends and community in Myanmar and wanted to do something there. And they decided that they could, with Atutu, have this network of engineers and designers and folks ready to help build something, but they really believed and had seen in their own experience growing up in Myanmar what it looked like when especially the Western world showed up with solutions. And they had, many wonderful stories of receiving those resources, waving goodbye, and then using them for completely different purposes, because there was no true knowledge of what was needed locally. So even though they were from Myanmar, even though it was their family and friends that they were communicating with, one of the first lessons that they learned is they are not there now, right? Even if you are from a community, if you are not in that community, operating, experiencing, living in that community now, whether it's a physical, geographic community, cultural community, any other identity, you can't speak on behalf of, you cannot represent the choices of, and that was a kind of realization they had from the start. So they decided to bring together community members locally and figure out, just as we asked in those other questions when Afua showed the community slide, what are your needs? What are your dreams? And what emerged from that was folks really wanted lighting, specifically to support kids continuing to learn in the evening, but they didn't have light in their homes or in their school buildings. And it could support other folks being able to, have businesses, do anything else in the evening with proper lighting. And again, they didn't want to build something in the US and fly it in and say, here's your solution. So they decided to be very explicit from the start of the project. Whatever we build, we're going to do it together. And you, the folks on the ground in this community, will be the owners when we are done. So it really openly changed who showed up to the meeting, literally in that moment, as well as what was going to be committed to, because they knew from the beginning, this will be ours. So the responsibility and the accountability is already there, and it really shifted power in a dramatic way. So they knew they wanted to focus on lighting. They knew that they in the local community would be the owners long term. So that meant, instead of saying, great, what's the fanciest thing you can find, in the store in San Francisco, the question was, what are the tools you have access to? Oh, it's actually, most common are motorcycle parts. Okay, different tack, let's go that direction, right? So everything was informed from the local experience outwards instead of externally. They had one, for example, big lesson where they used all the parts that the folks in Myanmar said they had. They put everything together. Okay, here's the lighting system. They set it up in the lab, went home, showed up the next day, right, in San Francisco. Oh, look, the light's still running. It clearly works. Mailed the parts in the instructions over to Myanmar. They set it up. Instantly, everyone's complaining. This is a really loud system. The light is buzzing. There's no way we could work or study with this setting. How did you not notice this? Oh, we put it in the lab. We didn't sleep underneath that light. We didn't sleep in this setting. This wasn't in our home, right? Again, really not honoring what the local context required. So they redid all of that. And ultimately, what they were able to do is find a local school where they could do that as their pilot, set it up in the dorms so that teachers were able to have lights on for after school study time, figure out which lights worked, which ones were not noisy. And at that point, they called them fellows, the folks who were on the ground kind of leading on the Myanmar side. The fellows were able to show it, physically show it to other folks in the community. This is what we can set up in your home, right? And start to build out different places where they could set this up in the community and grow it as a sustainable business that never a tutu was trying to own, right? When new folks came and said, hey, we'd love to contract for you to set lights up here. They weren't contracting with a tutu. They were contracting with the fellows, right? And because that ownership of the community was committed to from the beginning very explicitly, they were able to move at a very different speed than a lot of projects who maybe later in the process say, oh, we'll transfer ownership to the community now. They were able to go from having the idea to start this project to community ownership with contracts through the government to even build for entire communities in 18 months. An incredible rate that otherwise wouldn't have happened had they not been so committed to the local community, to the local context and knowledge, and for co-defining that process the whole way so that they really knew what the fellows needed to learn and where their role could be supported. So I want to stop. I realize it's already 10:37. We would love to chat and hear questions that folks have. Enrica, I'll hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amy, Afua. This has just been incredible to see the slides, everything, the case studies. We have a great question in the chat on designing for historically under-designed for communities. But before that, as your host, I'm going to take the mic myself because I have a question that I am dying to ask both of you, which you touched on a bit in the last case study with the Project Sunbird, but I'm just dying to jump in with a question on kind of friction in these tech projects, right? And how we come together in these different roles, whether it's policymakers, community members, technologists, every role really. If we're not designing from the beginning of a project, if I think on my own experience as, a member of the policy and social impact team at Lyft, most of my job was to go into community discussions and say, okay, if you do have Lyft already in your community, what do you want to see change? What do you need? How can we make this experience better for you? Working with the policymakers at the legislative level as well. So talk a little bit about it, if you will. What happens when there's friction when a project has already started and already pretty much come to fruition? How do these different roles interact when that happens?
Afua, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think friction, I think it's important to note that with all of this work and whenever you're working on changing mindsets, changing development processes, it is a change management process. And so friction is almost to be expected if you are not experiencing a little bit of friction as you were changing something. Beware, I would say. So what I've seen from my experience in many different sectors. And so as we think about technology projects and as you get towards the end and then you want to bring in the feedback and suddenly you realize that what people need is different than perhaps what the engineers or technologists or whatever powers that be decided, there are a couple of different options. One is you can just say, thank you for your time. Thank you for your feedback. We're sure someone somewhere will use this technology. And I'm sure we can all think of products that have done that and sort of dismiss that and have gone on to flounder accordingly. Or you can really take time to think about how do you start to engage that process and recognize that you're solving for a few different things. And one is timeline. So you're probably going to have to extend your development timeline. This is something that I think people often get pushback on, is that we can't take that extra time. At the same time, many technology projects take longer than anticipated. So let's make sure, I would say you can make the argument, let's at least have the extension be for something that is actually going to ultimately help more people and the technology organization's bottom line as well, because we're actually going to be designing something that people can use. And so I think framing some of that pushback into who are we designing for, who's actually going to be able to use this, how is it actually going to be able to be sustained, and especially if you're working with for-profit tech company, tying it back to if the users aren't going to use it, it's actually not going to be profitable. So this trade-off is necessary. I think that's really important.
Yeah, fantastic. Amy, anything you wanted to add?
I know that if it was a little bit frozen, so just in case Zoom catches up. But I just wanted to add to what Afua was saying. I think there is no technology project that's done. Like, we might stop a technology project, but like we created, like it's all pre-dead, like we made it, so we can just either keep making it, change how we make a part of it and stop making the other part of it. Like it is in our control. And I think sometimes that reality that it is in our control is, for a lot of different reasons, feels like it isn't a truth we can operate in. And I think acknowledging where we do have that power, like this is under our control, is important. And that in every change, there are people that benefit and there are people that are burdened. And that is the reality of every change and every moment. So again, having very explicit conversations so that we are eyes open and intentional, there is going to be someone who is further burdened by a change. That doesn't mean we're going to find a path where no one is burdened. It's about saying, is that a burden that is worth the benefit for these other folks, right? Is it, for example, when the government rolled out the vaccine process, right? And at first, if we can remember a time, if our brains can still hold the concept of time, when vaccines first came out, prioritized only for much older folks that were highly immunocompromised, that sort of thing, right? So it was like this whole long online application to try and get one. And a lot of communities of color, very, very low percentage of them signing on, right? And if you reach out and talk to those communities, well, it's a horribly long and complicated form. It's like 10 pages. And if it times out, you're done, right? You've lost your spot. If you don't already have all of your like cards that you have to enter, that was a horrible process, huge burden for the users. But I'm sure it highly benefited the workers who were like, oh, I don't have to do any data entry, right? Everything came from the form perfectly. Instead, if we say, actually, the government side can handle more burden here to make this easier to benefit the users, that's a good path forward, right? It's not about just pretending that no one will be burdened, but the burden should be on the government instead to allow for a online access form that folks really could use, and was far more accessible to more people, especially the people, again, like most burdened by the pandemic as well. So I just wanted to name that dynamic in that conflict as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Amy. And I think Afua, we lost her.
Okay.
We're going to try and get her back here.
I am back now.
There we go.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Afua, I'm glad that you are back, especially for this next topic that we're going to dive into that Amy just touched on, actually. When we're looking at designing for communities who are historically under-designed for, right? We think about seniors, we can think about unbanked folks, we can think about communities who don't have easily accessible internet or don't have access to smartphones. I saw that Jennifer in the chat has, a real eye towards that. So can we discuss really when you're actually looking at the tech of it all, right? And perhaps this is really a question for technologists to address. How do we really design the tech to make sure that we're addressing all those communities, even if we don't necessarily have their ear or, their perspective to completely have in conversation?
Yeah. We can have their perspective. So
yes.
I would always challenge that.
Yes.
The idea that, we as the project team need to be the voice for the users is false. The users have a voice. You are just not listening to it or giving them space at the table.
Yes.
So number one, start there. But I also think, whether we're talking about older folks, disabled folks, whoever, most of the internet was not built for most of us, and it was not built by most of us. So it isn't like, let's name a couple categories. It's like most everyone fits into that in a lot of different ways. But the first thing that comes to mind, I know it's a little bit different specifically than Jennifer naming older people, but at NTEN, we do a lot of digital equity work, have a digital inclusion fellowship where we're helping folks in local communities build up digital literacy programs. So of course, that's often with folks most excluded online, older folks, folks of color, disabled folks, et cetera. But there's this whole category of people that often get forgotten in these conversations, which is folks who've experienced incarceration and have a very legitimate fear of what going online is going to mean for them. It means their record, whatever that means, is following them. And so how do we think about what fears are real barriers for folks being part of these conversations? How are we further making vulnerable people that are already vulnerable by asking them to be in our processes, right? What are we sharing with them? What support, protection, education, et cetera, are we providing them so that they can really be part of this? We've seen great programs that didn't say, great, well, let's get you an email address right away, that said, you can come in, we'll use the internet and find you what you need, and build up comfort and confidence for folks, right? So that's like a digital training perspective, but I think with older folks, there's a lot of that same, there are fear-based barriers, and finding ways to get around that aren't, okay, just forcing them online. Amber Case does so much great work around calm technology, quiet technology, the idea that you shouldn't have to be aware of the technology if it's doing its job. It should just do its job, you know? I'm going to stop so Afua can share.
As I say often, I agree with everything Amy just said. But to just underscore that first point that that they made, which is that you can have the perspective, right? It is back to how we started with, a lot of times tech is built without specifically stating those values. Tech is often built without specifically stating who is going to be using the technology. And so we can make intentional choices to bring in new perspectives. We can make intentional choices to make sure that you are talking to the people who will be using the technology. And given the realities of what the tech development workforce right now means, it likely means going outside of that bubble to take the time to talk to people and to bring in those additional perspectives, and then to design around that. And so I'd say these are intentional choices, which we haven't made, but we can make. And I would encourage you to, whenever you have the time, to advocate for that and to really push for that. I think the other thing that I'd just emphasize as important when we talk about designing for different people is to recognize that we do have differences amongst different populations and different people. And so it might be required to have different ways to engage in the information that you are wanting people to engage with. And so I was working with an organization recently, which was having a lot of community advocacy, and had initially put everything on a website for people to provide information there. And then also had community members where they had the ability for people to fill out the same form, but basically in person, because they would be there, which, you know, sounded like a great idea, because we both have the website for, actually it wasn't even a website, it was an app where you could go through, you have the interface, it was so simple if you had a smartphone and wanted to use it in that way. And then they had their in-person solution, which had pen and paper and was great if you could make it to the very few community meetings that they had at those times. And so what they ended up doing was designing another way to interact with their community, which was just developing a text interface. And so it was something that they could text out to people periodically, with various levels of comfort. Most of that community did have at least a cell phone, if not everyone having a smartphone. And so they could respond at their convenience via text without having to get to the location specifically, or having to have a smartphone, and the comfort level and the confidence in the smartphone technology to use the app. And so I think also, as you're thinking about some of the outreach, you may want to be doing with different communities, the elderly and others, recognizing that perhaps coming up with a third option, getting to that third solution might be necessary, and taking the time to really come up with.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think a question that I would pop in before we really open it up to in real time questions as well. And this was kind of alluded to by Carla in the chat, with, is this addressed through community? Is this addressed through philanthropists, VCs, founders, right? Who maybe holds the agency of is the wrong term to use, but who holds that initial charge, right? Because all of this takes money, all of this takes resources to be able to go into communities, to be able to actually, do this very important work. How do we see that coming to fruition?
Yeah, and so this to me goes back to what we talked about when we said there is a role for everyone to play. And so I think oftentimes when we pose the question of whose job is it, it's because we sometimes want it to not be our job. And so I have done that as well. As like, whose job is it to write this report right now? Oh, it's mine. Got it. But I think that's true here as well. And so recognizing the power that you have and the role you have is really important, and recognizing the relative amount of power. It might be that you are a junior developer. I saw someone comment that in chat. And so the amount of power you might have is to, when you're given something, just ask, did we talk to anyone about this? Or, can you share with me any documentation about the results of the focus group that we ran on this so I can use it to help design my feature? And then the answer might be no. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe we'll do it again. Or, if you are a policymaker, being able to say, what process did we run to do this? What ideas did the community have that reflect and have been taken into account into the legislation that we're considering or legislation that we are proposing or we're actively drafting right now? It could be as a tech or as a social impact organization leader, thinking about have I really provided enough training for the people on my staff to actually use the technology that I've told them they should be using? Or have we actually made sure that the technology we're using, our community members and our clients can actually access that technology? Or do we need to think about that education process? Or if you're a funder and investor, it can be, if you're a venture capitalist, did we ask these questions about the overall process and inclusion as part of the overall evaluation process, which is something some venture capitalists are doing. As a philanthropic institution, perhaps, have I made sure to ask in any type of application my grantees are putting together for them to specifically identify ways that they have partnered with communities, ways that they have brought in community impact, and ways that they have changed their process and changed their tools based on the community impact. That is something I've seen with at least 3 foundations that I've worked with this year alone, as people changing and adding those questions into application processes. And so again, as we think about whose responsibility this is, there's something that we can do in any of those roles that you have, and just make sure to lean into the power and the levers that you have.
Just want to add, thinking back when we had the slides up and Afua was talking through the where we're at, black and white, everything's horrible picture, and then yay, everything's beautiful, super colorful picture, right? So we're planning for the colorful picture, which means, and I'm not saying this to be hyperbolic or something, but we're planning for a world where when we talk about community and community ownership, it's because that is the structure, right? We don't have to have an IRS that then determines a tax status of an organization that provides core human needs, right? We've moved past that. One day we will move past that, right? And we won't have to be, having the tools we build or share or use created either by, a for-profit tech company that had 2 really wealthy people fund it versus underpaid nonprofit organization that had to operate in a different tax status, right? What if those systems that are already harming so many people don't stick with us, right? And we get rid of those systems. So it's from that perspective that we talk about community and community ownership in the book, because that means those who are using are the ones, accountable and leading how it is maintained, how it continues to be built. And when we think of it from that perspective, this conversation about whose role is it, and Afua's comment, well, it's all of ours. It truly is all of ours, right? If we are thinking of this less about, well, I'm in, to your example before, I work in Lyft, or I'm a policymaker trying to decide what whatever policies are that relate to Lyft, or I'm a user that doesn't own a car, so I need to rely on Lyft. What if instead, right, that was a tool created by the community of users, maintained by that community of users, accountable to that community of users? I'm not saying like, oh, that's easy and we do it now, but if that's the place where we think we're going, it really shifts, again, back to our values, how and who we prioritize in our process.
I mean, I think that this is just showing me that we need to invite you back for another conversation on open source, right?
Yes.
And knowing that we lost Afua, and knowing that we have
I'm back.
left. Oh, you're back. Amazing. Thank you. Hi. So happy to have you back. I want to open it up very quickly to one last in real time audience question. So if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question so we can get to it, and then we'll wrap up shortly after that.
Yay, unmute.
I just have a question kind of about the logistics of community organization and leadership and ownership. As communities are being redefined and as it's becoming more global due to the internet, this is a really broad question, and I'm sure it varies.
It's okay. This has been a really tactical conversation so far. To
community, but do you have any strategies for when communities are often, in different locations and people have different modes of communicating, and when there's a large group of people maybe in one community, what that looks like?
Yeah, I'll just really quickly say, I think those geographically distributed communities or projects are a perfect example of why having really clear values at the start, communicated and agreed on, is important. And that, ripples into, like we were talking about, and if we're valuing true accessibility and participation, how are we meeting? How are we making decisions? How are we communicating? Where's the change log? And do people know how to reference it, right? All of those become part of how you even get started, how you are formed, so that you can then bring new people in and orient them to what's been agreed, right? I think from a practical social perspective, those are the most important things. And of course, Marika, you said open source. There are, a number of open source projects that have really tried to live true to that spirit of being open and clear about what are our values, how do we meet, how can people participate, that we can learn from, and also, see how to improve from there. Afua, what would you say?
Yeah, I'd say communication early and often is really important. And so just really recognizing that it is a change management process. So communication is important. Being clear about the values, as Amy mentioned, is important, and tying decisions back to those values as you inevitably make decisions everyone will love and decisions not everyone will love. And so really bringing it back to those early agreed upon values, I think, is really important. Then I think also, just really practically speaking, finding and empowering a number of advocates along the way. And so it's not just one person's passion project, but it is really reflects the community and many leaders. And so you have many voices carrying that forward. So it does then become a collective effort and not one or even a small group of leadership somewhere, their project.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rebecca, for that question. And we are at time, folks. It looks like Amy is maybe in the Zoom frozen area.
Thankfully, Amy, it seems like you get either Amy or myself all day today.
Yes.
We're just trading off.
But Afua, thank you so much for being here. Please extend our thanks to Amy, for everyone who joined. Really appreciate you joining. We will be active with Future Talks, and please follow the Meetup page for more information on future Talks. For all relics on the call, you have access to Amy and Afua's book, The Tech That Comes Next, on Overdrive. So please go and check that out in our internal system. But to everyone who joined, thank you so much. We're looking forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for having us.